at the end of today's presentation. I want to say welcome to the University of Illinois Extension's Local Government Education webinar. My name is Kathy Brown, and I'm with the University of Illinois Extension Community and Economic Development team. Today's program is the first in a series of programs that we'll be offering this fall that have been developed with the support of local sponsors that are oriented towards the local government's role in economic development. For today's webinar, we have Michelle Velasquez, who is with the U.S. Department of Commerce, and Jennifer Daly, who is with the Greater Peoria EDC. And they're going to be discussing comprehensive economic development strategies at work in Illinois. Michelle Velasquez will present first, and she is an economic development specialist with the U.S. Department of Commerce, with the Economic Development Administration. And she's based in their Chicago regional office. Michelle serves as the point of contact for the Partnership Planning Program and administers grants to the 57 economic development districts in a 6-state Midwest region. Her role supports the development and implementation of comprehensive economic development strategies. Michelle has worked as an urban planner in both the public and private sector. Prior to EDA, Michelle was an associate with the Lakota Group, a planning and urban design consulting firm that's based in downtown Chicago. We will begin our exploration of CEDS planning with Michelle taking over as the presenter. Michelle?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
It's coming through loud and clear.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. As Kathy mentioned, my role with EDA is the point of contact for the Partnership Planning Program. Through that program, we fund the development and implementation of comprehensive economic development strategies, or CEDS. So I'm kind of considered the subject matter expert for CEDS for our regional office. Just to kind of go through, what is a CEDS? A CEDS is a locally based, regionally driven economic development planning process. In economic development planning, as it's implemented through a CEDS, it's not just the cornerstone of EDA's programs in which we build for further implementation, but it serves as a means to engage community leaders, leverage the involvement of the private sector, and establish a strategic blueprint for the regional collaboration. It also provides capacity building, a basic foundation for the public sector to work in conjunction with other economic actors such as individuals in the private sector, business firms, major industries in the region, and help create an environment for regional prosperity. The CEDS is not just a document itself. It's an actual process that continues on and on. We consider it as having a life cycle. In developing a CEDS, the starting point would be assessing where are we as a region, doing background analysis and gathering of information on current economic conditions, reviewing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as they apply to the region. What are the major transportation systems, major industry sectors, major employments? What is the current state of the region? That's the basic starting point. From there, using some of the background information, we ask ourselves, where do we want to go as a region? That leads us into a visioning process on, if under all conditions, aside, where do we want to go as a region? What does our vision look like? After identifying a vision, we ask ourselves, well, how do we get there as a region? What processes, what strategies, objectives do we need to put in place to get where we want to go? Those first 3 steps of our CEDS process essentially occur in the development of the initial CEDS document. But the way that EDA views the CEDS process is It's not just done once the initial strategy document is created. It's a continuing process whereby you're evaluating your progress in implementing the SED's goals, strategies, and objectives, and then making adjustments according to what current economic conditions. Things may have changed since the initial SEDS process started. So it involves a final evaluation process of how are we doing in getting there. And at some point, a SEDS does have a shelf life. A planning strategy created 10 years ago may not be as relevant today as it was 10 years ago, and that's where you start again at the starting block, reassessing where are we as a region, and let's rewrite the document and start from a fresh starting block. Now, EDA funds SEDS under two different programs, our partnership planning program and our short-term planning program. Our partnership planning program, and I know we have a few of our economic development districts that we fund under our partnership planning, maybe on the call today. But in funding these comprehensive economic development strategies, there are certain guidelines on the content which EDA, in order to consider a successful process or a successful strategy. In 2015, EDA implemented new SEDS content guidelines. Prior to these new guidelines, EDA's requirements for our SEDS guidelines were very technical, almost like a checklist of required things to include in the document. EDA has moved away from having specific technical requirements and broadened the scope to more inclusive guidelines that would allow for flexibility to create strategies that are relevant for that region. That SEDS is not something that's a one-size-fits-all type document. So the new SEDS content guidelines are intended to help the regional planning organizations craft more impactful SEDS. The focus is more on the content versus the process, and it offers more suggestions on what could be included as part of the SEDS instead of dictating required sections to be included, regulatory requirements. And also includes a tool set, recommended tools, resources, and examples to help in the development of a SEDS document. So our new SEDS guidelines, there's a little screenshot of what the document looks like. It is available on the EDA website. The basic format of our guidelines first gives an overview of the SEDS process, kind of explaining the purpose of the SEDS, how SEDS can be used for guiding investment decisions for the region. Then the SEDS gets into the the required content sections, which include a summary background, Swot analysis, strategic direction or the action plan, evaluation framework, and discussion on economic resilience. The SEDS guideline then goes into discussing formatting, recommendations on how to create a more concise and impactful document, some discussion on preparation or process, and then how EDA handles SEDS documents that were funded outside of EDA, or essentially equivalent or alternative plans. As I was mentioning, some of the recommended resources within the document itself, you can kind of see on the page that's included in the slide that the content guidelines includes a lot of hyperlinks. These links are to example SEDS created by other regional planning organizations. Usually they're referencing a specific methodology or specific section within that SEDS that is a good example or a best practice that could be used in other areas as far as best practices in implementing the SEDS. Some of the key points that come from our SEDS content guidelines as far as formatting recommendations, because this is a big effort that EDA has made in crafting these guidelines, is to be more inclusive and not to have more leeway in how a region approaches their economic development strategy, and as I was saying, not a one-size-fits-all type approach. But a very important part is just keeping your audience in mind, especially with regard to target page length, including an executive summary, use of appendices. I've seen planning documents that are 150, 200 pages in length, and while they do contain a wealth of information, some member of the community or elected official, looking for some information, that creates a challenge in finding it within such a lengthy document. And trying to narrow it down to a concise document makes it easier for keeping your audience in mind. And also in that line, communicating creatively, creating appealing look and feel, alternative formats, use of maps, GIS, tables, other graphics that help communicate information in ways other than just narrative text. I find that to be a very helpful way for communicating information very concisely and creating a visual impact as far as the document's concerned. And then also thinking beyond the document. How would stakeholders use this document? As I was just mentioning, a lengthy document makes it less useful sometimes for outside stakeholders looking for information on strategies, what's been crafted for the region. And then as far as the content recommendations within EDA's SEDS content guidelines, some key points are looking to link the sections within the SEDS together to improve the focus and the measurable impact of the SEDS. Keeping those sections down to key elements such as workforce, broadband, energy. If there's a certain background area that's very important and a theme throughout the SEDS, it's important to focus on that and not brush over it. And avoid spending time on areas that aren't of much relevance or have little impact on where the visioning and the strategic process is going. Spending a lot of time on geological conditions or other background information sections just kind of weigh down the SEDS. Also emphasizing measurable goals, strategies, rather than a standalone list of projects. One thing we would find at EDA in reviewing SEDS that were submitted under our programs is as far as a implementation, our economic development districts would just include a long list of projects, a wish list of projects that they would like to implement. And while that is still a good practice and certainly something that's still recommended to be included in the SEDS, I think there needs to be a little bit more discussion on how do you get those projects done, what's involved in putting those pieces together. So looking at also integrating and leveraging other planning efforts and resources, looking at other components such as workforce development, transportation funding, other areas that are tied in with economic development, zoning and land use. Some of these areas may be more relevant to some communities than others, but using those areas of relevancy and tying them into economic development and driving the local economy. Also infusing the idea of economic resiliency into the SEDS. This is a big focus that EDA has been initiating, this concept of economic resiliency. And back at the back at the introduction section where we outlined the required content, you'll notice we included a reference to an economic resiliency section. A lot of times this is handled through a simple SWOT analysis of identifying possible threats and weaknesses in the area that need to be mitigated. Also looking at ways to diversify the economy, looking at the strategic end of the document. And then as far as the SEDS are concerned, linking the sections together to improve the SEDS focus and measurable impact. As I was mentioning, all the elements of the SEDS should build upon each other and in one way kind of lead into the next section, helping to shape each other resulting in a coherent and targeted document. The SWOT analysis section is key in this regard. This is where you're identifying areas of focus, major opportunities, major threats to be mitigated. And the strategic direction and associated action plan should logically flow from these critical internal and external factors that basically speak to the region's assets and limitations and its role in the capacity. And then getting to the evaluation framework with its associated measures and timelines, that should cascade down from the strategic direction. You've proposed certain projects to be implemented. How do you know whether those are successful? How are you measuring your success on whether they were completed or successfully completed? So again, the flow down from SWOT analysis to strategic direction and evaluation framework. Including key elements such as workforce, broadband, energy. Again, the SWOT analysis section recommends assessing a wide variety of regional attributes. Some of the key factors that are common among regional strategies, identifying the state of the regional economy, including clusters, partners, resources for economic development. What is the potential for global competitiveness, exports, foreign direct investments, aspects of workforce job training, spatial efficiency, sustainability, broadband, energy, natural hazards, equitable development. And again, some of these topic areas may be more relevant to some regions than others. So it's more focusing on what tells the tale or the picture of your region. Emphasizing goals, measurable objectives, and strategies rather than standalone list of projects. As I was mentioning, the strategic direction and action plan are kind of the heart and soul of the document. That strategic direction should evolve from a more clearly defined vision with prioritized goals and measurable objectives. A successful action plan should then focus on regionally driven strategic priorities that will result in a prioritized, measurable collection of capacity building activity areas. So the action plan should not just be a list of projects, but and it shouldn't necessarily be exclusive or reflective of projects alone in which EDA would participate. EDA's focus, again, with the new SEDS content guidelines, is that the SEDS would not be a document that's just used for submitting to EDA, either for a planning grant or for applying for an implementation grant for a construction or public works project. You should be including the full realm of economic development, even if your priorities include looking at workforce development and labor, environmental aspects, which may involve leveraging funding from EPA or state level agencies. It should be a comprehensive document that fits the full gamut of economic development. And integrating and leveraging other planning efforts and resources. A big emphasis is looking on this concept of cross-pollinate, that the SEDS should integrate other regional planning efforts. SEDS should also identify opportunities for integrating use of other local, state, private, and federal funds. that the SEDS could theoretically be used across multiple planning efforts, even beyond just economic development, tying it into transportation planning efforts, land use policy. So this concept of cross-pollinating and using the document for integrating other planning efforts. And then again, infusing the economic resiliency into the SEDS document. Each SEDS must promote regional resiliency and be unique and responsive to the relevant region. And that's in terms of resiliency. When we define economic resiliency, we're talking about the area's ability to withstand, prevent, or quickly recover from major disruptions to its underlying economic base. And that economic resiliency can mean different things to different communities. For example, communities that might be prone to flooding, looking into flood mitigation efforts. We want to mitigate the impacts of flooding events and how they impact the economy and shutting down businesses, requiring road repairs. These are things that aren't traditionally looped into economic development, but they are a contributing factor that, as part of a resiliency component, do build on the quality of life and economic strength of the region. SEDS serve as a critical mechanism to help regions identify those vulnerabilities and withstand and recover from those disruptions. So integrating resiliency into the SEDS can take multiple forms. You kind of need to assess and identify assets and vulnerabilities. And again, this is where the Swot analysis ties into identifying what are some of these areas of vulnerability with regard to economic resiliency. And economic resiliency, I know I just gave an example that was more related to disaster resiliency, but that again ties into the economic impacts. Economic resiliency can also tie into the industry cluster and how diverse the economic base of a region is. Communities that have a economic base with one major employer or one major industry sector, we've seen it happen over the years in certain areas of the country where reliance on one major industry has negative impacts when that industry is affected, and it trickles down to the community levels. So looking at economic diversification is another example of how economic resiliency can be incorporated into the SEDS planning process. And then looking at how we define economic resiliency, we kind of break it down into a steady state initiative, looking for longer term effects to bolster the community's ability to withstand or prevent a shock. That would be more something along the lines of economic diversification. And then responsive initiatives, establishing capabilities that allow an organization or region to respond to a region's recovery needs that follow an incident. And that's where a disaster resiliency type example comes into play as a more responsive initiative when a disaster should occur. But as a recommended best practice, EVA suggests taking a look at both the steady state and responsive initiatives, implementing specific goals or actions to bolster the long-term economic durability of the region, which would be steady state, and establish information networks among the various stakeholders in the region to facilitate active and regular communications between the public, private, education, and nonprofit sectors to collaborate on existing and potential future challenges. That's more of a responsive type of effort in economic resiliency. As far as equivalent or alternative plans, as I mentioned, EDA funds under two different programs, our short-term planning program and our partnership planning program. Funds organizations to develop a comprehensive economic development strategy. But this is not something that you have to do that can only be done with EDA funding. We do see a number of comprehensive economic development strategies that are funded at the local or state level, outside of EDA, with aside from our involvement, and certainly we recognize those efforts. Our formal approval process, we formally approve SEDS in which we fund under a grant program, but we certainly do accept equivalent and alternative plans when it comes to implementation funding under our other programs: public works, economic adjustment assistance, technical assistance. But as long as the plan is current, the plan is prepared and addresses our content requirements in the SEDS content guidelines, then we consider the plan acceptable. We also encourage and support plans that are considered nesting, where a SEDS is integrated with or leveraging existing action implementation plans and evaluation frameworks from another plan. Good example of this may be organizations that do a similar planning process for example, a HUD Sustainable Communities grant, and that effort in the SEDS process is very parallel to what they might be completing for EDA for completing the SEDS. And rather than doing two separate planning processes, combine that process in one, and even combining the document in one, and being able to have it meet both purposes. One document that can be submitted both to EDA and HUD, and be considered addressing the needs of both programs. Well, that concludes my presentation for the SEDS content guidelines. I guess at this point, Kathy mentioned we'd be holding questions for the end, but I do have my my contact information on the screen there, so if there are any questions after the program's over regarding SEDS, I'm certainly available. Feel free to reach out to me. With that, I'll turn it over for the rest of the programming.
Thank you, Michelle. We're going to let this load again. Thanks for the great overview there. I think, sorry. I'm going to give a brief introduction for Jennifer. I think Michelle has provided us great background on the EDA planning process. Jennifer's going to talk with us a little bit about how that strategy was actually built in the Greater Peoria Economic Development District. Jennifer Daly is the Chief Executive for the Greater Peoria Economic Development Council, and it's a position that she began in November of 2014. Prior to her regional appointment, Daly led efforts of the Morton Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development Council for 6 years. During her time in Morton, Daly and her team assisted the community with several business development projects, including American Tile, Yin Lung, Monsanto, Farm and Fleet, and Sam Lehman Automotive. Their work also created a new downtown development plan and raised the funds needed to build the first piece of that plan, a new downtown plaza. Daly was also the co-founder of the Iowa Children's Museum located in Coralville, and it's a great privilege for me to be a part of the Greater Peoria Economic Development Working Group. Jennifer's doing a wonderful job of leading the charge for our region. Jennifer?
Thanks so much, Kathy. It's really an honor to be a part of this webinar, and I appreciate you inviting me to do this. I also just want to say Michelle's background was just terrific. Really a great kind of foundation to build on for me. All those specifics about SEDS and development of SEDS. As Kathy mentioned, I started with the Greater Peoria EDC in November of 2014. And when I started, the organization had really gone through quite a big change. So I just want to tell you a little bit about that and our process of developing the SEDS, and then what we're doing now towards implementation. This is the region that we serve. So we have a 5-county area, an economic development district. And so you can see that it's five counties in central Illinois. So it's a pretty broad area. It includes, we have 2 very urban cities, both Peoria and Pekin. We have suburban areas, and we also have rural communities. So it's quite a diverse group to work for and to support. So in 2012, a lot of community leaders kind of came together, and both elected officials as well as the private sector. And there was a pretty robust organization in place that was working on regional activities and including economic development. But there was definitely a feeling that maybe we needed to approach the problem in some different ways. And I have this slide for those of you that have a screen in front of you that says, some of the problems that we had, and this might be, you might look at this list and say, gosh, we're struggling with those things too. We had maybe weak collaboration across the region, still a lot of people working in their own silos. Perception that there was really no regional strategy, lack of a balanced approach to economic development. So economic development was definitely viewed as being all about recruiting businesses. And so just, not a very balanced idea.
Jennifer, I'm sorry, can I stop for just a second and ask Tom if he might help? It seems like we're having a little bit of difficulty, everyone seeing the slides. Tom, can you step in and help us out here? Are you?
I'm here.
I think it says they're fixed now. If I'm looking at the notes, I think folks are saying it's fixed.
Okay, all right,
Yeah,
let's proceed.
I'm seeing them fine at my end here.
Okay, we'll keep going here.
Great.
So, we had all these issues. Innovation assets were not well developed. Workforce was really pretty weak. People really didn't kind of equate economic development and quality of place. So again, really when people thought about economic development, it's a very narrow kind of idea. Aging population. We really lacked mid-sized firms. We're home to Caterpillar. So Caterpillar, we're the earth-moving capital of the world, which is fantastic, except our economy is not very diverse. And so that's a real challenge that we have here. So, we had all of these problems and a lot of people coming together to try to figure out what to do. And so, I put this cartoon up because then it's a group of people that says, what if we don't change at all and something magical just happens? And I think that there was definitely kind of folks that in the past maybe were kind of hoping and praying that something would just great would happen. But I think 2012 was kind of a time where people said, gosh, we better start doing things differently if we really want to see something different happen in our region. So what they did at the time is they brought in a consulting firm, Vital Economy, gentleman, Frank Knott, who owns that firm. And they actually spent about 2 years on a very major kind of development process for a new SEDS. And so the process what took place over 2012 and 2013, and it was massive, and it was funded in part by a grant that our Regional Planning Commission had been able to secure. So our ability to pay Vital Economy for their support in doing this was through that grant. And I just have a couple things here about the process. We had to get a lot of influential leaders to the table. It was really important that they were there and felt like this was an important part of what we needed to do, and that they needed to be engaged and involved in it, and both on the public sector, but also really on the private sector. So that was important. One of the things Vital Economy did that was great is they helped to educate all of the folks that became involved about economic development and kind of how your economy works. And we just found a lot of people didn't understand that. They didn't understand what economic development was, and kind of the process for kind of developing a better economic development system within your region, and kind of digging in beyond just kind of, traditional business recruitment. So that was really important. One of the things that happened was there was extensive outreach through all 5 counties, and that took a lot of time. There were a ton of meetings, and there was a lot of phone calls and reaching out and trying to get unusual suspects to come out of the woodwork and to join people at the table. And so for the first time, there were people that nobody else, kind of had ever seen, whether they were from different counties than the traditional, maybe just Peoria or Tazewell. We saw these other folks come out of the woodwork, and also from other sectors and from other organizations that had never really been invited or didn't feel like they'd been invited to be part of a discussion about economic development. So all of our workforce folks and people who are working on things like healthcare initiatives and healthy communities, and our housing authorities who are working on housing issues, and these kinds of folks, I think they would say that they had never felt like they'd been part of that conversation. We did a ton of asset mapping, so looking at what are the assets of our region, what are our real strengths, what things make our region unique, because we knew we needed to create a plan that was based around those assets. There were lots of meetings, and I kind of laugh about this, but I mean, there were lots and lots and lots of meetings, and there was lots of groups that were formed to look at assets and to look at specific clusters, and to look at specific counties and their assets, and so it did seem at times a little overwhelming, and like there was countless meetings, but there was a really good reason for doing that, and so we kind of continued through that process. A big part was the dismantling of old systems, and that was really hard. And so for folks on the phone that are part of regions where there's kind of maybe you might call it an old guard, and a certain way of doing things that have been that way for a really long period of time, sometimes it's kind of hard to dismantle those systems and put new systems in place. And a lot of that time over the 2 years was about dismantling old systems and putting new systems in place, a new core group. And because of that, I will tell you, not everyone was happy. So, there were some people that were unhappy through that process. But ultimately, it did kind of evolve into something that I think most people today, even those folks that maybe were not very happy at the beginning, ultimately today I think would say maybe we're in a better place. So, one of the things that Frank Nunn of Vital Economy kind of came to our region and really brought was this balanced sets approach, was this idea of starting with your assets and building your plan around your assets, and really looking at economic development and your strategy beyond just business development. So looking at human capital, which is your workforce, looking at quality of life. And for us here, a big part too was really acting regionally, because we really weren't. We had regional organizations, but we really weren't planning together in a more comprehensive and collective way. So for those that are familiar with collective impact models, it was a lot of training and discussion and education around how do we move past working in our own silos and move towards a more collective approach, and then how do we have this balanced approach where we're not just looking at business development, but we're also looking at workforce development, we're also looking at community development and quality of life. So targeted outcomes and I'm not going to go through our strategy because it is, it would be a lot for our webinar today, but I'm happy to share that strategy, and it's actually posted on our website. But I'm also happy to email that to anybody who's interested in that. But I wanted to share these were the targeted outcomes that we hoped to gain over a 5-year period. And so you can kind of go through here and you can see that they reflect both kind of business development goals as well as workforce development goals. And you even have housing in there. And some other things. So it was definitely a broader view of our development, and certainly much broader than our SEDS document and plan had ever been in the past. So this is our plan, and it actually just got submitted to the EDA not very long ago. It took us a while to get all the partners together and to confirm it and to put it in an appropriate format to submit. So, but we're really, really happy that that's on file now with the EDA as our official SEDS. So I want to talk a little bit then about moving forward, because one of the unique things about our organization is I know a lot of SEDS are developed and implemented by a planning commission. And we're actually the Regional Economic Development Organization in our region. So we really, our core focus is not planning, it's actually doing. It's actually doing the work. And so, I want to talk a little bit about how we moved forward past planning and what we're doing now to actually implement our SEDS plan. We formed a SEDS committee, which is a requirement through the EDA, but it's become a much larger committee than it ever has been in the past. And here's a couple things that we did. The committee itself meets 6 times a year, and we purposely have meetings that rotate to each of our counties. And that's very purposeful because in part it helps us maintain our regional viewpoint, and it helps the people in the room continue to get an understanding of the different places within our region. We specifically wanted to make sure there was at least one person from each county that was invited to be part of the group, and luckily we actually have multiple people for most of our counties, which is great. Every organization who's implementing something in the SEDS is invited to be part of the committee. And so, we don't, our goal isn't to have a very kind of a small committee. For our SEDS committee, our goal is really to be very inclusive. And so in our plan, because we have things, specific strategies and goals around tourism, around housing development, around healthy communities, business development, workforce development, our goal has been really to reach out and to find, any organization that is working in that arena in the region and invite them to be part of the SEDS. Now, one thing we do ask is any organization that is part of the SEDS, we ask them to commit to the process. So we ask them to, understand the document and take the strategies that are within the SEDS document and have them specifically be part of their own strategies within their own organization. And we also ask them to share metrics. So, those are some of the things we ask. If you're going to be connected to the SEDS and helping us carry it out, those are a couple of things we ask our organizations to do. And then our SEDS does have subcommittees. So we have 3 right now. We have a communications committee, a metrics committee, and a projects committee. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Communications, one of the things, and Michelle kind of talked a little bit about this, sometimes what happens in those SEDS documents is they're kind of cumbersome, right? They can be really long, they can be detailed, they can have a lot of language in them that isn't very accessible to just, kind of people in your region that you would really love to know about this strategy and to understand it. So one of the things our communications committee is doing is going through the plan and turning the language in the plan into more digestible pieces, easier to understand, infographics, things that can help us share the plan very, very widely throughout the region. We're working on a website right now, and our goal is to launch that by the end of the year, that takes that informal language and again, makes it very easy for people to understand what we're trying to achieve, who's involved, how we're measuring success. We're gathering success stories through our organizations that are involved, and doing presentations about the plan. So those are some of the things the Communications Committee is tasked with and is working on. Our Metrics Committee is working on three main things: gathering data from our various organizations that are a part of SEDS, and figuring out the best way to kind of take that data and align it and share it in a way that's connected directly with our SEDS report. And we're really in the early stages of this. As you can imagine, every organization kind of collects and shares metrics in different ways. So getting everybody to kind of agree on how we're going to do that and doing that in a collective way is a little bit challenging. So we're working on that. We know that's going to take us a little while, but once we have a good system in place, we think it's going to be terrific. And then we already, as an EDC, we do a quarterly report that's very metric driven. And so our goal is to add on top of the metrics and data that we share as an EDC, to add in the metrics that are a part of the SEDS document as well. And then finally, the Projects Committee. So for anybody on the phone who's been involved with SEDS in the past, you may remember a time where a lot of SEDS documents was ended up being primarily a laundry list of infrastructure projects. I apologize about if you guys can hear the train, it runs right past my office. So sorry about that. But anyway, our SEDS used to be the same way. So it was primarily a laundry list of infrastructure projects that were rated highly in the region. And it really not necessarily much more than that. We wanted to still include projects in our SEDS because we knew specific projects were going to be important to carrying out our goals. But we needed a way to evaluate projects and determine which projects to include and how to rank them, and then to have a goal of really kind of becoming champions for those projects and helping them get funded. And so Vital Economy, again, they really brought this idea to the table of doing a scoring process almost like a grant process. And we went through and did that for the first time in early 2015 was the first time we did that, and we're getting ready to do our second project call right now. So what we did is we promoted to all of our communities, our local economic developers, any of the organizations we were involved in, and we said, we want you to submit a project. If you have a project that you're working on or that you want to work on or that you're excited about that can help us achieve these SEDS goals, we want you to submit it because we want you to help you achieve it. And so, we did a project call. We collected those applications, those project applications, and we had developed a scoring system based on our SEDS. So we had a team of 5 people who were deemed to be regional. So they were carefully chosen as people who, knew about the SEDS, but they were truly regional because that's important when you have 5 counties and, everybody wants projects to be treated fairly, and you're going to have projects submitted from different cities throughout the region. So we had 5 people who scored, and then we went on after we scored. We ranked the projects, and we did a funding pitch competition. I have a couple slides about this. So this was our timeline. Just to give you an idea of, we promoted the project submission. We had an application form. The application submission, it was no more than 10 pages long, and it was specifically designed to align with our scoring system, which was all aligned with our SEDS document, our SEDS goals. So every project was scored based on its alignment with our SEDS goals. So you can see here the timeline, our project submission, they were due April 30th. The top scoring projects were given the chance to come and present their projects to the scoring team. So those were the top 10 projects. They got that opportunity to come in and present. And then our team of scorers, they had the opportunity after that to adjust their ranking of those top projects. And then we announced the projects in July. And then we did our first project pitch, which we invited all of the funding representatives from our federal agencies, as well as from our state agencies and our local funding sources like the Community Foundation, to come and to listen to these project presentations with the hope of making matches. So what we wanted was for each of our top scoring SEDS projects to be able to present their project to this group of people that had money and programs with money, and to see if we could help find some matches. So we did that then the following February. For our process, government agencies and nonprofit organizations can both submit projects. We do not open it up to private, for the private sector. The types of projects we were looking for, they really had to have a regional scope. They had to directly impact our SEDS goals. They could be a program, physical construction, or technical assistance or planning. And this is a big change from in the past when our laundry list of SEDS projects were all basically construction. We really said, you know, we don't really care if they're construction. We're more interested in understanding projects that could really help us pursue our SEDS goals. You know, why submit? I mean, we didn't, you know, obviously we didn't have a pool of funds ourselves. So we had to make the case of why, you know, these different organizations should take time and actually submit their projects. So here's what we shared. It was an opportunity to educate others about their project. You know, if they were a top-ranking SEDS project, they would be more eligible for federal grants. They would get that opportunity to pitch to a panel of local, state, and federal agencies. And, you know, the other thing is, and this really did happen, but going through the process definitely helped some of our cities and organizations formalize their project plans. Having to go through and develop that 10-page document, answer our questions, create a presentation, it really helped a lot of them, I think, get more organized around their own plan. These were just some examples of the types of federal grants that their project could be, you know, eligible for. Some things we kind of said it was important for them to remember about their submission. And then we shared with them, and you know, this kind of shares our scoring system and how we did that. And we have, you know, a detailed scoring document that helped our five-member scoring team. It helped them really evaluate each project and score them. So I just wanted to share kind of, you know, our view of how that process went. We had 25 projects submitted. We did have projects submitted from every county, which we were thrilled about. 15 of those projects were identified as lead. Now, we went into it thinking we would stick with 10 to 12, but really once they were scored, 15 there was a clear measure between the scores of the top 15 and the others. So we just went ahead and made that decision. 10 of those 15, those top 10, were invited to present at the SEDS project pitch. We would have loved to have all 15 present, but we simply did not have time. We needed to give each project at least 30 minutes to do their presentation and have a Q&A with the funding panel. and we simply didn't have time for all 15. So we allowed the top 10 to do that. Of those 10 projects, 4 are in the grant process cycle right now. 1 is waiting to hear on an EDA submission for an infrastructure grant. 1 is currently waiting to hear on a technical assistance submission. 1 is preparing to submit to the EDA this fall, and that's an infrastructure grant, and 1 is preparing an EDA submission for 2017. It's another project. We also have a project that was able to link up with the USDA and receive grant funding from the USDA, and we definitely raised awareness with the Community Foundation of some, important projects that they needed to partner with. So, overall, we really felt it was incredibly successful. And with that, I know here at the end we're opening it up to some questions. I think on the sideline. So we're happy to answer any questions, and my information is also on the slide. So if there's anybody who is interested in more details or would like copies of our SEDS documents or our scoring system documents, we're certainly happy to share those with anybody.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's a terrific story and a great illustration of many of the principles that Michelle talked about in her presentation. So it's been an exciting journey for the Peoria region. We'll wait for a couple of seconds to see if folks do have any questions that they want to submit. So here's one that it's asking for areas of the greater Peoria region, but who lie outside the 5-county region, such as portions of Fulton, Knox, or Marshall counties. Where are they involved in the process, or where do their views get expressed in some fashion? Michelle, do you want to respond? Maybe both Michelle and Jennifer could respond to that.
Well, I'm happy to share since I think Earl's asking specific for Greater Peoria. Through our process, we really did focus on the 5 counties that were part of our economic development district. So, and that was a very big area already to pursue. So, so that was the area that was the focus, and is still our focus. We love our other friends in the other counties, but several of them are involved with another economic development district, and so we have our 5-county areas, so that's where we focus. And those are the folks that we invite to come to the table to be part of planning and the project submission and everything that we do.
Right. So the economic development districts is the kind of the qualifier, and those maps are identified on the EDA website, I believe. So that would be a good point of information for folks that may not necessarily know which district they reside in. I can speak to Knox and Fulton are both part of the Western Illinois Economic Development District that's managed by the Western Illinois Regional Planning Council. So if there are representatives from those communities, but really EDA would be the definitive organization that would help define those. But thanks, Jennifer. And I think you do often work outside that boundary with programs that are appropriate. So I have a question here, Jennifer, that some of the structures have changed and people were not happy about that. Can you mention a couple of the structural changes that were utilized to help enable more cooperation?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was an organization that existed prior to the new process that was called the Heartland Partnership, and it was a kind of conglomerate of organizations with a parent company that was called the Heartland Partnership. So it included the Chamber of Commerce, the Economic Development Council, Peoria Next, which was an innovation component. There was a foundation, a CEO council, a port authority, and a couple other organizations as well. And they were all housed together and under a parent that was called the Heartland Partnership. And one of the things through this process that happened, I think the biggest structural change was the EDC was pulled out of that structure and given its own autonomy. And as you might imagine, there were folks that did not like that and felt it was a mistake. Other folks felt like it was a very important thing to do. And so that's an example of a major structural change that happened.
And maybe just one more question. Jennifer, if you can talk a little bit about leadership as a key to economic development and also as part of the process.
You know, actually, it's interesting that I think Charlie asked that question because it was talked a great deal about through the process with Vital Economy, and there was a feeling that there wasn't enough leadership. And leadership is something that I think that term is used a lot. And so, you know, we have lots of leadership programs in our region, as other regions may also. You know, we have our chambers do leadership programs. Bradley has a master's program in leadership, and there's certainly a lot of programs that speak to leadership. But I think what was really happening here is the way our boards were structured and the way things were working, people were hesitant to speak up. So even if you had people who were strong leaders in their own companies or organizations, the dynamic of when they came together and were on a very large board and were, you know, sitting in rooms and things like that, there wasn't a structure, I think, that allowed them to feel comfortable being leaders and really kind of engaging in what was happening and also questioning when they needed to what was happening. And so, you know, I will tell you, we haven't totally solved that problem. It's still something we think about every day. We have a board of 35 people, and they are primarily company CEOs and very busy people, and that's a large group. And so one of the things we've done is we have a 15-member executive committee that helps. That meets every month, and it's a smaller group, and it's a lot easier to get more conversations happening and you know, really kind of, you know, try to engage in discussions and make people feel comfortable. We have advisory teams. That's another way that we've tried to bring people in and give them opportunities to kind of lead discussions or to engage in specific projects they're passionate about. Our SEDS committee is another example. We also have a workforce alliance where all our workforce folks come together monthly, and we have a technical work group, which is all of our local economic development professionals. That's really our boots on the ground team. And so, you know, I'm not sure I totally know how to answer your question, Charlie, except to say that we're constantly trying to identify strong leaders and bring them in to help us do what we're doing. And most importantly, I think beyond that, is we're trying to make sure that they are put into situations where they can truly leverage their skill set and their voice, and where they feel comfortable doing so. And that continues to be an ongoing challenge for us.
Thank you, Jennifer. And to Michelle, it looks like we've reached kind of that magic time in our program today. both of our presenters have done a fabulous job of, talking about the process, but also illustrating how it's working within the region. They've also provided contact information and would encourage you to reach out to each of them. I want to say thank you. The recording will be made available in probably a week or so, and we'll stay connected. Thank you so much for today.